Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Up, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. It's episode 218, and in this episode, we're going to have Gina McClain talking all about how to shepherd your volunteers through challenging times. So this is the third episode, so to speak, in the series where we're kind of replaying the volunteer boot camp training, where we talked all about volunteers and recruiting and shepherding and reactivating volunteers from the bench, all that. So this is the third one. Gina's going to talk about how to shepherd volunteers through challenging times, which it has certainly been, right? And we need to care for and pastor and shepherd our volunteers. And she's going to talk about that. You can get all the links and notes at nickblevins.com/episode 218. From there, you can link to the actual volunteer boot camp free training if you want, where you can watch the full videos of these, some of the Q&A, and get any notes that we have as well. So that's all I have for you as we're about to jump into this. Let's listen to Gina tell us about how we can better care for and shepherd our volunteers.
Thank you. Yeah, well, so that's our topic focus right now is shepherding volunteers. And what's interesting is listening to the previous sessions, there is a lot about what you're going to hear now that it can almost sound redundant, but actually what I'm hoping that it does, it simply underscores. It underscores not just the need that exists now, but the need that has always existed. I just believe it is amplified, maybe highlighted more today than it has been in the past. And it's just all around the need to care for people, to love people. This is a phrase that you might have heard in the past. We want more for you than we want from you, right? And maybe you've heard that in the past. Maybe you've heard this phrase also, that volunteers really want two things. They may never verbalize these things, but they want two things. They want to feel needed and they want to feel known. Now, that might be the first time you've heard that phrase. It might be the 100th time you've heard that phrase, but let that sink in just a minute. Volunteers want to feel needed and they want to feel known. At the end of the day, people just want to feel needed and known, right? And if that is true, if that's the case, well, the needed piece is not hard to accomplish, is it? Like I can walk you by a nursery or a 2-year-old room on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. and show what need looks like. Gotcha. I can walk you by a group of 15 7th grade boys during small group time. I can show you what need looks like. Need is not difficult most of the time. Known can be trickier. And that's what we want to land on today. You see, when it comes to shepherding volunteers, it's all about making sure that our volunteers feel known. And here's the thing, the challenge with that is, it's not just about, do you know them? Because you could say, oh, I know my volunteers. Would they say you know them? That's the difference. And I believe that's the side of the question that we really want to take a close look at. When it comes to shepherding volunteers, do they feel known? So let's hit that first. Why is that so important? Well, because when it comes to shepherding, and we go into scripture and we can find, if you were to go in and do a word study, you're going to find a lot of references, especially as Jesus spoke to his followers, you'll find a lot of references to the concept of a shepherd. A shepherd is very important, and it was an image that Jesus wants his people, his followers, to understand. What does shepherd mean? Well, I Googled it real quick in preparation for today. I Googled it, and here was the best fitting definition that I discovered. A shepherd is a guide, or is somebody who guides or directs in a particular direction. That's pretty simple. Makes sense. A shepherd guides and directs in a particular direction. Well, we know when we look at that and we consider that within the context in which we lead, what we are doing is we are guiding people in the direction towards Christ. Whether they volunteer for us in preschool ministry or elementary ministry, whether they work in our resource room, whatever area of ministry they are serving in, whatever function they serve within the team, when it comes to shepherding their hearts, our goal at the end of the day is to help them to recognize, where is God calling them to take their next step, and how can we help them to do that? And sometimes helping just means showing up and being there. It doesn't necessarily mean telling them what to do. It doesn't necessarily mean having the right, perfect resource for them to lean on or use in that season. A lot of times it just means showing up. In fact, I believe that when it comes to being known, there are two words that I think about every time when I think about a volunteer or somebody feeling known. And it's the first word is seen. The second one is heard. Seen and heard. What's interesting is I would have said for a long time, I would have said those are really the same thing. Like if I see you and I hear you, I'm kind of accomplishing the same thing. But actually my mind has changed about that. You see, when I went into the book of Acts in chapter 3, this is where I'm going to get all scriptural on you, but I think it's powerful because it's such a powerful moment. At least it was for me. When I go back into the book of Acts and in chapter 3, this is a moment where Peter and John, they're traveling into the temple and they pass by a beggar. Now, this is somebody that has sat outside the entrance to the temple. They've sat out there for daily for years. For John and Peter, they passed by this guy every time they go into the temple. They passed by him many, many times. It wasn't an abnormal thing to see, but you watch, if you go back to the scripture and you read it, you notice that what Peter did something significant in that moment. And I took a little bit deeper dive into a different version of scripture that I had not read before. And here is what it says that Peter did. As Peter and John were passing by, and this beggar who's asking for handouts, basically, he's asking for help. He calls out to Peter and John, and it says that Peter fixed his gaze on this man. He fixed his gaze on this man. It means that he chose to look at him intently. He chose to look at him with purpose. He chose to focus on this person and no one else around them. I think that's what seen looks like. I think that when it comes down to it, when somebody says, I feel seen, it's because somebody else decided for the moment to give their full attention to them. And that's the difference, right? That's what we want to do. When it comes to shepherding volunteers, if we want our volunteers to be able to say, I feel known, I believe the first thing that has to happen is they have to feel seen. And that means that there's an intentional, purposeful step taken, just like what Andre was talking about a few minutes ago. There was an intentional, purposeful step taken where you stopped for a moment and you made a phone call and you took some time to focus on no one else except that one person. It wasn't a mass email, right? It wasn't a copy and paste. It was a specific phone call. It was a FaceTime. It was a Zoom call with that one person where you gave them time and you simply said, how are you? How are you doing? I think the other piece to that, right? I said there's two words when I think of a volunteer feeling known. They feel seen, but they also feel heard. And the heard part happens after the question, how are you doing? Here's something that I took on recently. And it was a goal that I decided as I've been wrestling through this past season, right? And walking through, as I have conversations with ministry leaders and I find that there's a common theme in a lot of these conversations that I'm having. People are tired, they're frustrated, they're not sure where they're putting their effort is the right place to put it, and that they're getting a return on where their time is going. Right? There's so many questions and not nearly as many answers. And I decided last week that I'm going to give myself a challenge because I just want to do something different. And I decided I'm going to call every single person that's in my database, not send them an email. I'm going to personally call every single person on my database. Now, if I've got your number, I'll be calling you eventually. If I don't have your number, I won't call you until you give me your number. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that my number to the chat. I'm pulling a Bob Goff here, people. If I can get to chat, there we go. And I'm sharing my own number. And here's the thing. I'm a little tied up for the next minute, the next good bit. So don't call me right now. But I hit too soon, didn't I? 3381. There you go. There's my number. I would love to have a personal conversation with you. I've spent the last week, I've made over 100 phone calls, and 60% of them I've actually been able to have a one-on-one conversation. Not because I called one time and left a message, but because I called and left a message, and then the next day I called again. And did it feel stalkerish? A couple times it did. Did I know absolutely everybody I was calling? No, there have been a few times when I've had to say, hey, remind me how we know each other. But the thing is I've had the opportunity to have conversations with people, and they have been far more meaningful than I ever imagined that they would. But here's what I had to do in the process. After saying the question, how are you? and they initially respond and share a little bit about what's happening in their life, their very natural response is to lob it back to me and say, well, Gina, how are you? And you know what I could do in that time? I could dominate the conversation and tell them everything that's happening and all the things that are going on. And we could consume that conversation with everything in my world. And I could get off the phone a few minutes later, and that person does not feel any more seen than they did before. You know what? I had to stop that. And I had to actually say, now I'll answer the question. When they return the favor and they say, well, Gina, how are you doing? I'll give them a little bit of information. I want them to know. I'm going to honor their question. But after a minute, I'm going to pitch it back to them. Hey, you know what? The reason why I called is I really just wanted to know, how are you? What specifically can I be praying for in this season? If you feel safe enough, I would love to know. And the conversations that happens after that are so rich and so beautiful. And the thing that I'm learning is people simply want to be seen. They want to feel heard. And when I take the time and I don't make the focus about me, but instead I keep the focus on them, that is when they feel heard. They're beautiful conversations. Some of them take way longer than others. Some of them are just a few minutes. Some of them have been upwards of 20 to 30 minutes. You know what? And none of it has been time wasted, because all of it is just opportunities to be able to sit with somebody else in the space that they're in, to meet them right where they are so they can be known. Every volunteer wants to feel needed and they want to feel known. The question is, what system do you have in place in order to ensure that your volunteers feel known? They need to feel seen and they need to feel heard. And in order to accomplish that, it's so critical. I know that Allison talked about it. I know that that Andre talked about it. We've heard it already. The system has to be in place in order to accomplish this goal of making sure that our volunteers feel known. The challenge that we face today in ministry is you've actually got two different categories that you're working with volunteers, don't you? If you have reopened the building, the doors of your building, and you are regathering in person now, you have some volunteers who have returned. We've already heard about that. We've already talked about that. You've got some volunteers that have returned, but then you have another group of volunteers who have not yet returned. And maybe they don't feel safe. Maybe they're in a compromised category. Maybe they just don't feel like it's the right timing for them. And that's okay. It's important to honor that, but it is critically important to recognize that they're still your volunteers and they still need to be shepherded. No matter how far down on the bench they're sitting, no matter how bought in they are, they still need to be shepherded. And so the benefit that you have right now in the season, what you get to do is you get to go back and you get to sit down, you get to do your homework and figure out, what does my system look like to ensure that the volunteers who have re-engaged and they're showing up and they're serving now, again, as they did before, how do I shepherd them now? How do I ensure that they feel known in this season? But then also for my volunteers who have not yet decided to return, maybe they just don't feel like it's time yet. How do I ensure that they feel known as well? And I do think it comes down to a phone call. I think it comes down to a phone call. And this is where it really gets important when it comes to a system. You see, you can start making phone calls to people and you can feel like you're doing a good job. Feels great. But I don't know about you. I want to know that I'm accomplishing what I set out to do. So I've got a system. I've got a document. I've actually got an Excel spreadsheet that I'm working on and I make notes after every person that I called. I'm actually making notes. And if it's no longer a good number, then it's not a good number. You know what I'm doing? Here's a funny secret. I stalk them on Facebook. I know it's a little creepy, but you know what? You put information on Facebook, it's public information. So I'm not a creeper. You're just being free with all your info. There are some people who actually put their phone numbers in their Facebook profiles. That's amazing. So I go and steal that number and I try that one. Don't give up, guys. Don't give up. The most important thing that you can do is to reach out and show up and make sure that those volunteers know that you care and that you want to see them. You want more for them than you want from them. And the best way to prove that is to show up on their turf and to make sure that they know that you care about them. You simply ask a really, really powerful question. Tell me how you're doing. Really.
Well, I love whenever I get to learn from Gina McClain. She's absolutely one of my favorite leaders and loved having her talk about how to shepherd and care for our volunteers through challenging times, which it certainly has been and still feels like the middle of that, for a lot of people, for our team. So whether your church is meeting in person or not, and your volunteers are serving or not, I would encourage you to see and think about ways that you can still care for them and shepherd them, even if they're the ones that aren't serving right now because you're meeting in person, let's say, and they're not comfortable serving in person. So the action items I thought of coming out of there were just clear ways to care for and shepherd your people. Maybe you could text 5 people right now, as you're listening to this. Maybe you could call one volunteer. Think of somebody that comes to mind. I just had a great conversation with somebody who was a volunteer for me for a long time, hasn't been for a long time, but it was this kind of thing. And we had just a good talked for almost an hour. It was great to catch up in many ways because our church is meeting in person, but she's not attending in person. We just haven't had those conversations we would normally have. So that was a great thing. And then the third thing is to send 3 notes. Maybe you're like me and you don't love writing notes, but everybody likes getting notes. And so maybe you won't do all of this right now today. Maybe you could text today, call tomorrow, and write 3 notes, a couple of days from now. But what if this week you were able to do those things to care for your volunteers? And who knows what that'll lead to, because sometimes we don't know what's going on in their life. And this is how we find out, right? We reach out. So you can get all the links and notes at nickblevins.com/episode 218. There you can link to the Volunteer Bootcamp free course if you want, and watch the videos of these. Check out the Q&A that comes after we had these leaders speak, as well as get any notes that we have there if you'd like. So we're in the middle of this Volunteer Boost challenge that we just launched with Ministry Boost, where people are trying to recruit volunteers, and it's a 28-day challenge, and I am just so excited about it. It's probably one of my favorite things we've ever created. I can't wait to see how it shapes up. We're only a week in, and we're going to have our first check-in this week where people fill out a form and tell us how it's going. So I'm very excited for that. One of the things, I nerd out on data and analysis and all that. So I can't wait to get all the data from all these people recruiting and using the system and be able to share that with you. Like, what should you expect when you're recruiting volunteers? How many prospects do you need to talk to? All that stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun, and we will offer Volunteer Boost again. We're going to probably do it 3 or 4 times a year to have this 28-day challenge to focus on recruiting volunteers. You'll be able to learn about that at ministryboost.org. And we got a couple cool new things coming, another bundle that's coming out. We're opening up membership again. All that is coming in the next month or so. So keep an eye out for that. And listen here, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss one of these episodes. We'll be back next week with another episode about leading volunteers, and specifically reactivating volunteers from the bench. Andre Jones is going to talk about that. You don't want to miss it. So I'll catch you next time on the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.